morning, good afternoon, everyone out there. Welcome to our second Russia Disruption live stream. We're thrilled to have you here again with us today. My name is Sandy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. And this, of course, is a wonderful collaboration between the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations, the Malikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies at Arizona State University, and of course, the Council on International Relations. Let me, of course, welcome legacy members of the Los Alamos National Labs Foundation to today's talk. We're thrilled to have you with us again today. Hope you enjoy every minute. We, of course, do all kinds of work up at the Los Alamos High School, where we have some outstanding high school fellows, and every year stage our innovative policy simulation in Los Alamos, which always focuses on an issue around global energy, which of course is very interesting and important in Los Alamos as everywhere, honestly. This, of course, is the crazy pandemic year that keeps on continuing. So we are staging regular live streams on our live stream channel. Next Thursday at 10 a.m., we will feature Ambassadors Luis Moreno and Vicky Huddleston talking about the current crisis in Haiti and many other things. And two more talks coming up in our Russia Disruption series, and both of them I know you're not going to want to miss. First up, on April 8th, we'll feature the extraordinary Dr. Fiona Hill in conversation with Claire Seckler-Merkel and David Merkel. All details are on our own website, sfcir.org, and those of the PCFR and the Malikian Center. And then on May 19th, we'll be featuring Jameson Firestone. Many of you know that name. He, of course, his law firm in Russia exposed the largest tax fraud perpetrated against the Russian government by its own officials. His law partner, Sergei Magnitsky, was arrested, tortured, and killed in a Russian prison by the perpetrators of the fraud. And since then, Jameson has done all kinds of work in getting the Magnitsky Act taken up by countries around the world. So that's another talk you're not going to want to miss. So that is enough out of me. And now I'm going to bring in today's speaker, and I'll introduce him very briefly. Today we are featuring Professor Andrei Tsygankov, and Professor Tsygankov is a Russian-born academic and author in the field of international relations. He's currently a professor at San Francisco State University, where he teaches comparative Russian and international politics in the political science and international relations departments. He's written many books, published widely in all kinds of journals, and has a great deal to say about Russia today. So Professor Tsygankov, welcome so much. We're thrilled to have you, and looking forward to everything you have to say.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. This series, of course, it's called Russia Disruption. Others call it Russian revisionism. But the point, of course, is that Russia is challenging the West-centered, US-centered world order and the role that it leaves for Russia. And it insists on a different international system structure and a different world order, multipolar world order. So let me share my screen with you so you could follow my slides as well. And I'm going to make several points as we continue. And then, of course, I'll be more than happy to take some questions. First, I will argue that this challenge that we are discussing today and US-Russia rivalry, I will call it rivalry, began actually before Biden and even before Trump. And it can be traced to the early 90s, at least to the mid 90s. It took different form, this challenge, under Donald Trump and under Joe Biden. As you will see, and as you might have noticed from yesterday's Biden statement about Putin, the pressure on Russia will only increase, and US-Russia rivalry may get even more intense and dangerous. Fundamental reason for that is changing international system, changing world order, and the US and Russia are currently in a conflict, in a structural conflict over interests and values. And an important role here is played by China as well, and we'll discuss it separately as well. So first, let me say that there are multiple reasons in which Russia continues to be essential, important to the United States. It's a nuclear power. It holds a seat in the United Nations Security Council. It has strategic relationships with China. In fact, now it's even more than strategic partnership because the two sides are now discussing the possibility of a military alliance. Russia has a vast geography. It therefore is capable of influencing different regions and a potential contributor to stability, regional stability or instability in Europe, Asia, and Middle East. It has played a major role in counterterrorism, and it's important in many other ways when it comes to cybersecurity, energy security, or other issues. So what I will submit to you are mostly these 3 points: that Russia has failed to establish working relationships under Donald Trump, that we are not likely to see an improvement under Joe Biden. In fact, we might see even worsening of relationships. And the fundamental reason for that, as I said, is a conflict of interests and values in the international system. This conflict is now exacerbated by several other reasons and circumstances. United States domestic polarization plays a role. US media holds an image of Russia as essentially an enemy. And as if it wasn't enough, we also now have a personal mutual animosity of leaders, as expressed, for example, in yesterday's statement by Joe Biden, who called Vladimir Putin a killer. Putin, of course, never called Biden a killer, but we know from previous history, from previous experience, that he has no love lost for Biden as well. So that too will further complicate the relationships. First, let me talk about the relationships, the dynamics. Then I will move to explaining what I see is going on. And then we'll talk a little bit about future crises and possible solutions. First, about the relationships. Before Trump, specifically, Russia, of course, was engaged in assertiveness even before Trump. It started with attempts to cooperate with the United States, with the West in general. After the end of the Cold War, it actually went through 3 different cycles of trying to build strong relationships with the West, but each time each of these cycles ended in either disappointment or assertive foreign policy. This recent cycle, the 3rd cycle, began with Dmitry Medvedev's presidency. Some of you might recall who Dmitry Medvedev was. He was president and a comrade of Vladimir Putin, who was elected in the year 2008. This is the time when Barack Obama initiated the so-called policy of resetting relationships with Russia. Russia was also not strong at the time, affected by the global financial crisis. So these were potentially conducive conditions for improving relationships with Russia. And yet this cycle ended in assertiveness for multiple reasons, because many issues were not resolved. Many security issues were not resolved when it comes to Russia. It felt not satisfied with the way NATO expansion went. It also complained about the United States walking away from the ABM strategic treaty, establishing missile defense system in Europe that it found threatening its own interests. There were energy disputes. There were many issues that did not get resolved even under Dmitry Medvedev, who was more pro-Western certainly than Vladimir Putin. And then it culminated, these crises and problems culminated in Ukraine, in the Ukraine crisis, which set entirely new stage of intensity of conflict between Russia and the United States. And Ukraine continues to be crucial for Russia for multiple reasons. We will come back to this. So Donald Trump came to the office, as you will recall, with a very distinct worldview, with a very different idea of what the world is like than his predecessor. He wanted to project power and peace through strengths. He wanted allies to pay their dues. He engaged in protectionist policies, and he wanted to make deals across the world on the United States conditions. This is the worldview of an economic nationalist, if you will. When it comes to Russia and relationships with Russia, Donald Trump did not have any hostility towards Russia, vice versa. He viewed this as a partner. He viewed Russia as a potential junior partner in a coalition against China. China is the country that Trump viewed and continues to view as the negative other for the United States, if you will. He had a good chemistry with Putin in many ways, partly based on great power nationalism that I described, partly based on dislike for liberalism, that is also quite clear. But he was still tough on Russia in foreign affairs. As you will recall, he was not in favor of signing nuclear treaties. He walked away from the Iran deal. He did not support the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Putin was building with Germany. He provided lethal weapons for Ukraine, and he authorized cyber attacks against Russia, something that Barack Obama did not approve. Putin, in his turn, hoped to normalize relationships with the United States through Trump. Immediately after Trump came to power, he talked about some sort of grand bargain. What he meant mostly that there will be an opportunity to lift sanctions imposed on Russia by Western powers over Ukraine, over annexation of Crimea. And soon enough, he was disappointed. In a few months after Trump came into the office, he authorized a major missile attack against Assad in Syria, which potentially involved Russia's planes in Syria. They generated a crisis in April 2017. He imposed multiple new sanctions, so it became clear to the Kremlin that the relationships will not improve, and the Kremlin and Putin settled for what might be called a new pragmatism. We will clearly communicate red lines to the West. We will be cautious in cooperation, but at the same time, we expect that this administration, Donald Trump, will not engage in regime change, will not engage in undermining Putin as president, and therefore Trump is not perceived and was not perceived in Russia as an existential threat. That, of course, is different with Joe Biden. His ideas are ideas of global leadership, liberal world order, United States strong alliances, including NATO alliance, economic openness, dual containment of Russia and China. And that means new sanctions, that means continued pressures, including along the lines of human rights. Recently, Tony Blinken, State Secretary, made a statement that democracy will no longer be promoted by force, but of course, human rights pressures will continue to rise, and that too is a way to promote democracy. Here is a quote from a recent article published last year by Joe Biden in Foreign Affairs, titled "Why America Must Lead." The quote here, the critical quote, is underlined that it falls to the United States to lead the way. No other nation has that capacity. No other nation is built on that idea. And we have to champion liberty and democracy. So this is an exceptionalism, if you will, a liberal style of America first. On Russia, Biden was very critical. To him, Russia is not a potential partner, as it was to Biden. Instead, it is a spoiler, international spoiler, the negative other, if you will, which fits the bill because of the Cold War relationships. Russia was a former Cold War enemy. Now it is led by the former KGB spy, agent, authoritarian personality. And so Biden supports all kinds of exaggerated claims about Russia and Putin by Democrats. One of them, for example, that Russia's interference in 2016 elections is an equivalent of September the 11th, is an equivalent of Pearl Harbor. It's essentially announcement of attack, military attack on Russia. That is not quite a balanced assessment that American intelligence services had at the time. But Biden repeated it on multiple cases. This is from the same article where he makes the case that Putin is an authoritarian. He wants to tell himself and anyone else that he can dupe into believing him that the liberal idea is obsolete, but he does so because he's afraid of its power. And so again, on multiple occasions, he stated that there is a strong connection between Putin and Trump. He called Trump Putin's puppet in one of his election debates, as some of you might recall, responsible for bounty killings in Afghanistan. Again, US intelligence services had a different assessment. He even accused Putin of supplying arms for Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh war immediately after that war started. Why is he taking this position is an interesting question. Partly, this probably has to do with party politics. Media, US public now holds largely negative view of Russia. 75% or so are negative about relationships with Russia. US media is highly negative. What you read about Russia is primarily about investigations and interference in US elections, Russian authoritarianism, poisoning opponents, and some other dark art, so to speak, cyber war, interference, information war, sabotaging US actions abroad. So this really is a stark contrast with all the points that I stressed in the beginning. There is no discussion of how to deal with Russia on security issues. These 6 points of Russia's significance that I made in the beginning continue to be largely ignored in the media. And yet the dilemma for the United States is how to deal with Russia when it continues to be significant for solving so many important issues. But because of this image, and because of this domestic image of Russia in the United States, the arrival of Biden to the White House revived fears again. It revived fears that Russia's interests will continue to be ignored. And on top of this, unlike Donald Trump, Joe Biden will engage in regime change in Russia. And yesterday's statement by Biden about Putin's personal statement certainly will be read by many in Russia as a first sign that Biden is preparing a regime change strategy with respect to Russia. Part of it is that, again, Biden is fundamentally different ideologically, that many people who work for Biden also worked for Barack Obama and therefore presided over the Ukraine crisis, or in some respects responsible for the outcome in 2014. That's certainly the case in the perception of many Russians. And as I added earlier, this is now personal too. This is no longer simply business or politics. There is a personal issue, personal animosity involved. So what does one do in this case? Well, there is a proverb in Russia which sounds «Надейся на лучшее, but готовься к худшему». Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And that, I think, is something that can describe the mood in Moscow these days. Putin wants to prepare for the worst. He did not congratulate Joe Biden on his elections until the Electoral College vote took place. He engaged in new military preparations. He continued with cyber operations. The recent attack is not definitively, but still largely confirmed now by intelligence services. And he projected the message that we will only deal with the United States on the basis of equality. That's why you hear Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his deputy Ryabkov saying essentially that we are ready to cooperate, but we don't need you more than you need us. So we will only cooperate on equal basis. So overall, the mood is again revived fear of regime change and non-recognition. There is a hope for the best part too. Putin has put together a new nuclear treaty draft where all strategic weapons, nuclear and non-nuclear, are included, and sent it to Washington for potential discussions. In his first annual press conference that he held in December last year, he expressed hopes. He said that US-Russia relations were being hostage to American domestic politics. And he said that he hopes that given that Joe Biden is an experienced politician, both in internal and external politics, these problems, at least some of them, will be resolved under the new administration. Partly, this also speaks to a relatively new stage in Russian foreign policy, which is a stage of consolidating gains from the previous assertiveness. Russia has built its presence successfully in the Middle East, in Syria. It has its presence in Latin America and Venezuela. It has resolved successfully the crisis in the Caucasus. It has achieved at the minimum what it wanted to achieve in Ukraine. It has a presence in Africa as well. So at this point, it feels relatively secure, at least on all these foreign policy fronts. Let me move now to the second part and try to explain what we are experiencing, what we are observing in US-Russia relationships and Russia's relationships with the United States. Oftentimes, this crisis, and there is probably there are other ways to describe these relationships, but crisis is an appropriate term. Oftentimes, this crisis is attributed to Putin personally, that this is his fault, and ultimately we will not get out of it until Putin is in power because of the so-called regime instability theory. Putin's regime is not that strong, economy is not doing very well, and therefore Russia needs an image of an outside enemy. The United States fits the bill, and this will not change. And that's what explains the crisis in the eyes of many, many pundits and scholars. And I think that theory is the most widespread today in the United States. I think it's partly true that Russia is not strong economically. It only grows at the rate roughly of 2%. It has actually been experiencing serious economic problems ever since the global financial crisis in the year 2008. It also suffers from some administrative weaknesses. The state is not as consolidated. Some scholars even talk about fragmentation of this state. There is a lack of coordination among different segments of ruling class. But at the same time, the problem with this theory is that it really doesn't take seriously the sources of stability of Putin's regime. And that regime continues to be quite stable and internally legitimate. Putin's ratings continue to be quite high, and not only due to interference in abroad, not only due to the annexation of Crimea. There are internal reasons for Putin's legitimacy, and unfortunately, they're not very well understood. Russian political system in general is not very well understood in the West. It is viewed as some sort of neo-Soviet autocracy version. And not understanding the problem, not understanding the sources of it, creates a very misleading impression of what Russia's potential in foreign policy is. Second problem with this theory is that this anti-Americanism is only partly orchestrated by the Kremlin, is only partly top-down, so to speak. It is also bottom-up. It is also something that continues to be widely supported in different segments, not only political class, but Russian society as well, because it's a response in some respects to international pressures that are put on Russia to sanctions. Politically, sanctions create problems for some segments in Russia, but overwhelmingly, they serve the unifying role. Russia is more united as a result of foreign pressures, and generally speaking, it's not likely to be changed from the outside. And the third problem with this argument about regime instability, Putin's instability, Putin's regime as driving this crisis, is that these claims of great power that Putin, of course, articulates frequently precede him. Russia has been a great power for centuries, since Peter the Great at least. And whoever is in power, even after Putin departs politics, and someone else will be in the driving seat in Russia, it will still be claiming great power status because that's the fundamental part of Russia's identity and it has been around for a long time. Which is why a better theory is the one that stresses Russia's interest in international politics, its preferences for multipolar world order, and the United States' role in it, its foreign policy of global leadership that leads to Russia's defiance and unity. So that leads me to Russia's goal and interests. Let me talk about those for a moment. We, of course, now are in the stage of global power transition, where the United States and the West in general is slowly but surely sharing its political power with other nations, with rising power such as China and others, where rules will be changing as well. So far, we are experiencing only power shift. And it has two dimensions. One dimension is about order and norms and rules and principles, and the other one is about power. Russia is actually quite happy with the order and norms as they were introduced after the World War II, with the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, and others. It simply does not want the West to act in the way that undermines the centrality of these rules. It wants this world to be UN centered and not NATO centered, not West centered. It wants the United Nations to be the ultimate decider on security issues. And of course, in practice, as we remember, NATO often interfered without authorization of the United Nations Security Council. The second dimension is power. And here, Russia does serve as at least in some respects, as a revisionist power, because it wants the power to be more decentralized. As I said, it wants multipolar balance of power. It wants no meddling in foreign affairs, so-called internal sovereignty. And it does want to have some sphere of influence in Eurasia to feel secure. Most great powers, traditional great powers in particular, are extremely sensitive when it comes to sphere of influence issue. And again, the other side of it is that these interests and preferences are often non-recognized by the West. Russia was not very well institutionally integrated after the end of the Cold War. It wanted to be at the time integrated. It wanted badly to be part of the West. It went very far to proclaim itself Western power, but the integration was quite limited. Russia was admitted to G7. It signed the European Charter. There was a Russian NATO Council negotiated in 1997. But NATO expansion in the meantime continued against Russia's objections. It went through 2 rounds without ever inviting Russia to join the process. The European Union expansion, political and economic expansion, also continued, particularly towards the east. It was called the so-called Eastern Neighborhood Program, to which Russia was also not invited. On top of this, United States engaged in several foreign policy interventions, beginning in Yugoslavia in the late 90s, then Iraq and elsewhere. And in all of these cases, Russia was opposing these interventions. Then I already mentioned missile defense system instead of ABM treaty, that Russia, as the Soviet Union, viewed as the cornerstone of strategic stability. The United States also supported colored revolutions, and particularly in Ukraine. And more recently, we have seen all kinds of sanctions against Russia. So that too is a sign that Russia's interests, and read by Russia as an interest, that the sign that Russia's interests are not recognized. And as I mentioned, there are also other complicating factors, such as United States polarization, internal polarization crisis, and Russia has served a role in these crises as well. The United States is in the middle of political competition between two radically different visions of the world, radically different identity perceptions. And it's a process, you might say, of a new identity. And many scholars argue that identity struggle often requires the image of the other. And Russia serves as that image now. On the one hand, you have global leadership identity. On the other hand, the identity of nationalism of America first, exemplified by Trump. And I think for those who are on the liberal side of it, those who argue for the global leadership, for the global liberal world order side of it, Russia serves as the essential opponent, and that creates a potential difficulty for moving forward on the US side. Let's talk a little bit about Russian power, because of course, Russia is hardly in a position to symmetrically compete with the United States. There are two sides to it. US power continues to be quite strong. It certainly is the number one in the world. But at the same time, there are new issues, partly because of the rising powers. The United States is no longer capable to be as powerful, influential as it was 10, let alone 20 years ago. Russia's power is no match in many respects to the United States, although that has to be disaggregated. There are different levels of Russian power, but overall, for the purposes that Russia has, it is a fairly sufficient set of tools. It has well-funded military. It has well-developed intelligence, cyber, and information capabilities. It has a world-class diplomacy that recently demonstrated its capacity in the Middle East. It has national unity, which is, as I mentioned, is only strengthened by Western sanctions. And Putin's popularity will continue to be in place while we have sanctions. The more you pressure Russia from the outside, the more you're helping Putin politically. This is not a small country. This is a country with an enormous great power pride that will only continue to be developed as a result of foreign pressures. And yes, Russia is not strong economically. It's only 2%, actually less than 2% of the world economic product, for which it tries to compensate by developing relationships with China and other non-Western powers. So we have, as a result of this asymmetric rivalry, rather than symmetric rivalry with the United States, we have seen manifestations of this from Ukraine to Syria, more recently in cyber area. Russia's symmetrical approach is visible in nuclear buildup as well. It does not want to engage in the new nuclear arms race with the United States. It has other solutions, sometimes technologically advanced solutions. And it's not something that I would call Cold War or hybrid war. I wouldn't even call it a war. It really is a rivalry, partly because the goal is not to ultimately defeat the opponent. That's not what Russia is trying to accomplish. What it wants, as I mentioned earlier, is a greater share of power in the new system, great power status, recognition. and it builds the world around the West, slowly but surely. It's non-ideological, unless you recognize the ideological competition between liberalism and nationalism, but that's not global. That's something that is taking place inside the United States too. So that's different from the Cold War. It's more issue specific, and Russia continues to be interested in cooperation to the extent possible. One illustration here that I will use has to do with Ukraine. For Russia, it's a quintessential issue of importance. Here, Russia has had two non-ideological goals. It wanted Ukraine to stay neutral rather than to be in NATO, and it has been pushed into NATO since George W. Bush. And it wanted to have secure gas transit. It exports most of its energy, particularly natural gas, to Europe. And it has other pipelines, alternatives, but until these pipelines were built, 70% or so of Russian energy was transported to Europe through Ukrainian transportation system. It has sufficient power to assure these outcomes, in part because it has all geopolitical and military advantages. If it comes to military hostilities, make no mistake, Russia will be the winner. And it has energy independent transit routes preserved as well. And so the outcome right now is not favorable for Ukraine. Unfortunately, because of the Russia-West hostilities, it is practically broken as a country. It's divided, but it is out of NATO. So one goal is met here, and it's unclear that it will become a NATO member anytime soon or anytime in the future. And the second objective is also preserved, transit routes preserved. In fact, Ukrainians want them to be preserved because they're getting roughly $3 billion annually from these transit operations by Russia. And Nord Stream 2 is experiencing difficulties. That's the pipeline that connects Russia and Germany. But it's in process of completion. 95% of it is completed. The problem, of course, is that there might be future escalation in Ukraine. And that takes me to the final part. I'll take a couple of minutes to complete. And that's future relationships of Russia and the United States. As you can see, the picture that I painted for you is not very promising. Trump treated Russia as a competitor and junior partner. Biden as a competitor and a potential existential threat as well. Russia's power is asymmetrical, yet considerable to sustain the ground, to defend its interests. And unfortunately, that does not translate into solving very important issues. Security issues, cybersecurity, energy security, regional stability, climate. It seems to me that both sides will continue to be learning through crisis. There will be only limited cooperation. They already are moving from crisis to crisis. Joe Biden has been in power for only a couple of months, but they have been already at least two crises, and there might be future crises. One crisis had to do with Alexei Navalny and the situation in Russia that had to do with Navalny's returning from Germany. And Navalny, of course, is now being jailed and will serve 2.5 years in prison, largely for not fulfilling some conditions that was set by the Russian state. But much of it is political as well. And there are two possible reactions to this crisis: Russia's domestic problems with Navalny, domestic situation with Navalny. One is to escalate sanctions, to impose sanctions against Russian business, Russian oligarchs, and against the Russian sovereign debt, and possibly even tougher personal sanctions against people around Putin. And there is a more mild version of this, which is personal sanctions against some officials. The United States now decided not to escalate and did not go did not accept most radical scenario. So this crisis has been largely resolved. There is a new crisis now, which is crisis of cyber issue with solar wind. Uh, the United States believes, the intelligence services largely confirms this, that Russia interfered in solar wind system. And Biden promised at this point retaliation attack. This crisis is not yet resolved. This retaliation has not yet been carried out. What will come out, we are yet to see. But that's another possibility of learning through crisis. And each time it's very dangerous. Each time it can lead to escalation. With one side escalating, the other side will escalate further. And before you know it, we are in the situation of military hostilities. For how long this will continue? Well, I'm afraid this is going to be a fairly long period of time. Power transitions usually take time. Until we have a new polarity in place, new power balance in place, we will continue to live in this unstable and rocky environment. Soon after this, there might be new rules and norms established over security, economy, climate, and hopefully new domestic confidence will result from this as well. Both nations will manage to steer clear from scapegoating each other and start thinking about resolving real issues. But until then, no grand strategy on Russia is probably going to be developed. Hopefully, there will be a dialogue, restrained and interest-based dialogue. United States hopefully will try to build relationships based on power of example by improving its own domestic economic and political situation. There are many, many issues at home to resolve. And of course, deterrence will continue to be significant. Okay, I've exhausted my time. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. That was superb. We have a number of great questions here, and folks, now is the time to chime in with your questions. Andrei, I have a couple of questions, and
Please.
most of them center around recent events over the last couple of weeks. So, yesterday President Biden was asked on television whether he felt, President Putin was a killer, and Biden responded, quote, "I do." Why would Biden have said that? Or can you walk us behind some of the rationale for those kinds of remarks and what the implications might be from the Russian side?
Well, of course, it's extremely difficult to speculate on what went through Biden's mind at the time, but it wasn't a slip. It was certainly a calculated decision. Possibly Biden was thinking about the comparison with Trump, because Trump, some of you might recall, was asked the same question. And Trump's response was that there are a lot of killers in the world, and we are engaged in killings across the world too. So possibly Biden was again trying to differentiate himself from Trump for various domestic political reasons. As I mentioned, when you're asked this question by a journalist in a domestic political climate, media climate, a popular thing to say is that, yes, I see things very differently, and yes, will generate additional pressures on Russia and on Putin personally. The larger calculation, I think, has to do with the idea that we need to confirm our image of fighting for human rights. This is where we're also different from Trump. Putin jails his opponents, and we will support these opponents. So it's almost a clear sign to the Russian opposition that we are with you, because that's the message that Russian opposition, Alexei Navalny and others, have been articulating for quite some time. That Putin is a thief because he is engaged in all kinds of large corruption schemes on the one hand, and he is engaged in killing opposition leaders, beginning with Boris Nemtsov And that's the line that is now being upheld by Biden personally. And that's something that possibly is a calculated move on part of the United States to generate additional pressures on Russia. It will unfortunately create not the dynamics that the United States expects. It will not increase additional pressures on Russia domestically, because domestically Putin continues to be quite popular. It's a way for Russian leaders to use this pressure from the outside to generate the message that Russia is strong, it will continue to be powerful, and it will potentially be very counterproductive because it will increase not only tensions at home, but it will likely to lead to international response as well. Russia is not likely to leave it as it is. We are likely to see a decline of status in relationships with the United States. And probably soon enough, within days, we'll see the lowering of status, political status in relationships with the United States in response to this.
And Andrei, would you sort of apply the same rationale around the declassification of the DNI report, finding that President Putin authorized influence operations to help Donald Trump in last November's presidential election? Is it the same rationale for exposing or for President Biden putting his finger on, we're aware of what's going on, we know what you've been up to, and this kind of behavior we will not tolerate?
Yeah, this report certainly will serve as a reason for new sanctions over cyber operations that Russia is viewed as being engaged in. But again, the question is uh, what kind of response this will generate, whether or not this will lead to some personnel sanctions we have seen before against, for example, Prigozhin's Internet Research Center and Russian trolls who participated in undermining Joe Biden through social networks, or it will actually lead to cyber attacks. There is an important distinction here. One side of it is cyber espionage, the operations that are widely spread, almost routine across the world. Intelligence exists everywhere. The United States, in fact, does it even more than many other powers. But the other side of it is actually interfering with critical cyber infrastructure, potentially signaling that this infrastructure can be not only affected, but destroyed. That's a very different story. We live in a very different world, in a very dangerous world, where cyber capacity is almost like military capacity. And before you know it, this can lead to military escalation. So it's important to see what kind of response on the United States side it will generate. If it's simply sanctions against espionage, it's one story. But if it's a counterattack that will also translate in undermining Russia's critical infrastructure, this will escalate further. That's what I mean by the crisis.
Very good. Well, so we have a couple of questions about Alexei Navalny. And I'll start here with Adam Robney, who asks, how does your arguments that Putin's regime is stable and internally legitimate, how does that argument account for Navalny's role in Russian, political culture? Do we have an accurate picture of Navalny and his popularity here in the West, or would Russians view it very differently?
That's a good question. I think the impression that the United States and the Western media in general has of Navalny is not accurate. And I think to some extent, Navalny himself doesn't have an adequate image of his political potential, of his political capacity in Russia. He certainly has become much more visible and popular in Russia over the last several years. But if he expected that he would return from Germany and the Russian authorities would not arrest him because of his popularity, then he clearly miscalculated. Russian authorities meant to send a message that when they dealing with someone like Khodorkovsky or Navalny, whom they perceived as not only causing political problems but involved in all kinds of violations of state rules, then they will not hesitate to act. And it's possible that what they have in mind now it is Khodorkovsky model, that Navalny will serve his time and ultimately will not be part of politics anymore. Is he as popular today? As I said, his popularity has risen, and the fact that he's in prison right now is politically helping him, not Putin. In the longer run, he will become more popular, particularly when he's out of the prison. But again, Russia is a country of 3/3, so to speak, where only 1/3 is West leaning towards Western values. The other two-thirds are conservative, are more state-minded, more state-supported. So in all honest elections, unless these elections are rigged, politicized, Navalny stands no chance. Does he know this? I don't know. And I think the Kremlin knows this as well. It just is afraid of what I mentioned earlier of the regime change strategy. It is afraid that if Navalny is led to participate in popular elections, presidential elections, or any other elections, then he will stage a revolution if he is not proclaimed the winner, and it will create all kinds of problems similar to Euromaidan in Ukraine or elsewhere. That, I think, is what's driving the Kremlin's fear of Navalny. In honest elections, popularity-wise, I think Navalny certainly has no chance against Putin.
Well, let's stay with this idea of perception versus reality. And this is a great question from Keith Brown with the Malikian Center, one of our collaborators on this series. And Keith asks, is the Western view fair or accurate that Russia is uniquely dependent on oil and gas exports and is underinvested in advancing new and post-carbon technology and energy economies? What is the state of awareness of climate change and the will to act among the Russian public and our leadership? So two questions there. One, our perception.
Sure.
Second, the internal Russian perception on climate change.
Both are very good questions. Russia is greatly dependent on energy exports, continues to be. This dependence has declined considerably, but not sufficiently over the last 5 to 6 years. But it continues to export probably close to 45% of its export capacity of energy products, particularly oil and gas. So this dependence is considerable, but that does not mean that Russia is predominantly energy-based economy. Don't confuse it with Saudi Arabia or Persian Gulf-based economies. It is a fairly diversified economy. It continues to be even more diversified. Of course, part of this diversification is simply exporting more and less sophisticated arms across the world. Russia is a major exporter of weapons, as you know, but it also has all kinds of high-tech expertise. Computer industry is known to the rest of the world. It continues to export programmers, if you will, many of whom work here in Silicon Valley, next to where I'm located. So it has a fairly developed economy, but it needs to do more along these lines. And the second part of your question helps me to answer where, in which direction it will have to go. It will have to go in the direction of recognizing climate change. It has not done enough here, but it has done considerable part. It has signed the Paris Accord, signed and ratified it. It has recognized that this problem exists. It affects potentially quite seriously multiple areas geographic areas in Russia, in Siberia, in Arctics, all fires that Russia has experienced recently, probably connected to the climate change as well, because climate change is not just warming up, but it's drastic changes where winters are not the same and summers are not the same. So the question is what Russia will do about this. And this is one of those areas where United States and Russia can move forward. And there has been some progress already because John Kerry, who is responsible for this side of the United States policy in the Biden administration, has already spoken with the Russian representative on climate change. So we can hope that there will be further progress in this area. The problem in part is that to some extent, only to some extent, but Russia can benefit from climate change. There are negatives and positives. And in Russia, there are more positives than in some other countries that do not have 60% of your resources in permafrost area. So Russia has 60% permafrost territory. Russia has Arctic Channel that is also frozen for more than 5 months a year. And once the ice is melting there will be more business for Russia. So it has to be carefully negotiated what needs to be done. I would say Russians are willing and are interested in moving in this respect, but it will be a not easy negotiation.
Keeping on the subject of negotiations, I like this question a lot from Stephen Schreiber. Are hyperglide weapons being developed in Russia to provide more bargaining leverage in negotiations with the United States for all strategic weapons, now both nuclear and non-nuclear? Is this a step toward the goal of helping Russia maintain or achieve great power status in this evolving world order?
I don't know enough about that particular weapon system that is mentioned, but certainly new military technologies, cutting-edge technologies that Russia has developed recently is in part necessary for Russia to support and to put on display its great power status and to act to show that it has asymmetric capacity to demonstrate its capabilities. It is not, as I mentioned, interested in engaging in new arms race. It did it before, it learned the lesson, and one of the reasons why the Soviet Union lost, because it could not sustain the symmetrical arms race. It was way too expensive. By different calculations, the Soviet Union spent 15 to more than 15% of its budget for military expenditures, whereas today Russia's military budget is only 2%, in fact, less than 2%. And yet Russia is capable of building up new weapon systems, new ICBMs, such as YARS, for instance, hypersonic weapon, hypersonic ICBMs called Tsygankov is now being tested as well. It's interested in updating its military capabilities in the air area, modernizing strategic bombers as we speak. It wants to have new system now in the deployed called Sikron, which is hypersonic anti-ship missile. Air defense system is also very advanced. It is being sold abroad, but while it's been sold abroad to China and Turkey, Russia already moves up to a new level of air capacity. And that is done precisely because it wants to show to NATO forces, to the United States, that it has the capacity to penetrate the United States missile defense system, and it has the capacity to protect itself against potential attacks from NATO. Now that strategic system, the all strategic system called ABM-30, is no longer in place. That's what it means by asymmetrical capacity. And that's in part for military reasons. But the other side of it, I think um, the person who asked this question is absolutely right. It's also about status. Russia, first and foremost, wants to demonstrate that it remains a military great power. It doesn't want to use these systems, it doesn't want to use these weapons, but it wants to have them for the purpose of status.
So staying with Russia's foreign policy, another question from Keith Brown. What were the circumstances under which Russia supported the United Nations adoption of the responsibility to protect as a principle? Did that principle inform Russian operations in Georgia, Ukraine, and or Syria? And might it inform Russian policymaking or diplomacy going forward?
Yes, I think the reason why Russia supported that principle was that it was hoping to renegotiate areas of interference and non-interference, and it was hoping that this would all be done on the basis of the United Nations Security Council decisions. Instead, what we have now are two radically different interpretations of responsibility to protect, with the United States insistent that Russia is not uh, uh, acting consistently with the principle that responsibility to protect, because it interferes in some areas, but it doesn't allow criticism from outside of its own domestic system. And Russia, in its turn, is claiming that it is truthful to responsibility to protect because it protects its own citizens when it comes to interference in Georgia, for example. When the conflict took place in the year 2008, when Georgia first attacked South Ossetia and Russia responded by invading Georgia, one of the rationales provided for this by then the president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, was that we are acting based on the principle of responsibility to protect, because Mikhail Saakashvili ordered attacks against South Ossetia. Not only he killed many peaceful South Ossetians in Tskhin Valley and other places, as some of you might recall, more than 300 people died peacefully living in South Ossetia and actually while being asleep, because the attack carried by a Georgian president at the time took place around 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. But he also killed 10 Russian peacekeepers, and many South Ossetians held Russian passports. This is how Russia applied the principle of responsibility to protect at the time, which was not acceptable to the United States. The United States sees it very differently. So right now, there is no progress here. We simply have two very different interpretations, and the solution is yet to come.
So a great question here from James Crowell on a topic I find absolutely fascinating. And he says, speaking of great power competition and military investment priorities, China and the United States are prioritizing the development of artificial intelligence systems for military and economic purposes and exploring planet Mars for that matter. What is Russia's level of interest and investment in artificial investment technology?
Well, the level is very, very high. I don't know enough about the technological developments in this area, but the political level of it is easy to demonstrate once you Google artificial intelligence and Putin. You will come across a number of statements from Putin in which he says that this is actually the cutting edge of military development as well. This is where we must excel if we want to live, if we want to survive. So there is no higher priority.
Okay. Let's end our conversation by going inside Russia, inside the Kremlin for a minute. The question here from Mikhail Zolotov, which I think a lot of us have, is, is there the potential for the transfer of power from Putin to someone else coming in the near future? Are we in the midst of seeing another very long reign of a Russian/Soviet leader? Or, given your comments about Navalny and where Navalny may actually fit within the political spectrum, what are your thoughts about the domestic power, I wouldn't say struggle, but domestic power architecture going forward within Russia?
That's another great question. Very hard to answer because we are essentially in the speculations area. One thing is quite clear to me that Putin created a system that is largely dependent of on him serving as a broker between different power groups, clans, sometimes they refer to in the Kremlin. He is essential for all of these groups, and he will continue to be essential. And that part of Russia's political system is very difficult to change. He must have a successor he fully trusts, someone who will be in that capacity, someone who will fulfill that capacity. But the other side of that system is that Putin has also created, he has been in power sort of off and on, but he has been in power for some 20 years. He has created a new elite. He has established a new cohort, younger, more technocratic, mostly the elite that owes to Putin, uh, uh, that is highly capable, very, very high placed thanks to Putin. And this elite will not go away, whoever is in power. It will continue to hold most powerful positions in the central structure, regionally. The argument that Russia is only Putin dependent is only partly true, because not only is Putin the power broker in the center, but there are also different groups that are loyal to Putin will continue to be in power. And he will draw a successor from these groups. And once that successor is in place, that continuity is likely to be in place as well. I doubt very much that there will be new opening similar to the late 80s, early 90s for someone like Alexei Navalny. I don't exclude it. Russia has surprised us historically. But as of now, I think the chances are for a more continuous transfer of power. And Putin again is likely to surprise us. It's possible that the reason why he constitutionally extended his term until 2036 is simply because he doesn't want anyone to have additional hope, so to speak. But he may transfer power way before then, possibly even before 2024. We will see.
We will indeed. Final question for you. We have seen and been on the enormous roller coaster ride of U.S.-Russia relations from, President Trump and President Putin's meeting in Helsinki in July 2018 to, yesterday with President Biden, confirming he believes he's a killer on national television or global television. What is a seed of optimism you feel, Andrei, when you look forward to U.S.-Russia relations? What are some developments that we should be really keeping our eye upon to hopefully result in a more normalized, more diplomatic, more equal set of relations between our two countries?
Well, my ultimate optimism is that most people are still rational. They do not want this conflict to take place. There are emotions are high on both sides, but there are plenty of really smart and rational people on both sides, and they do not want this situation to escalate further, and they will be able to stop at the right moment. Ultimately, humans are not suicidal.
Indeed. Well, Andrei Tsygankov, thank you so much. Of course, professor at San Francisco State University. We've greatly enjoyed your insights today. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting.
Great. And as a note to all of you out there, of course, we have Fiona Hill will be joining us on April the 8th, and then we will have Jamie Firestone joining us on May 19th.
Oh, that's great.
It's going to be some fantastic conversations. And of course, let me urge you to visit the websites and subscribe to the mailing list and so on of our partner organizations on these talks, the Phoenix Committee for Foreign Relations and the Malikian Center at Arizona State University. wonderful organizations. This has been a fantastic collaboration so far. We have some exciting talks to come up. And until that point, we will see you then.